So there certainly are moments when we are going through midlife where we kind of hit a wall with something, right? Like it doesn't ever feel like it's just kind of a slope of of downward whatever. You're losing the estrogen and symptoms are showing up and it's like kind of gradual that way. It's always kind of a like a stair stepping, but sometimes the falls feel like cliffs. You're like going along and then boom, and then you're going along and then boom. And there is some up and down too, I would say, in midlife. But I have an example today of just one of the times in my life where I hit a cliff. That was a surprising cliff for me, and it sent me down a rabbit hole in the science about why this had to be. Why was this? So, the issue that came up for me was in a friendship, and it was a friendship that was quite meaningful for me, but it was newer. It was a brand new friendship for me, and it did kind of cross over friendship and business. I was doing some work with this person for a period of time, and but we just meshed. Sometimes you do, and I did not see coming for the life of me. Although in hindsight, see it now, did not see coming that it was coming to an end. Like some relationships just have a season for themselves. I can remember like it was yesterday because I'm actually recording this on a Monday afternoon. And this happened to me on a Monday afternoon. I can remember where I was sitting, what was happening on that call, to some extent, the exact phrases that were used, and, just kind of sat in disbelief as this person told me, I just don't think that this will be able to continue in the way that it is. Like, love who you are, Natalie, think the best of you. I hope you think the best of me, but I can just see that there is kind of this line in the sand, and we're not going to be able to cross it together as friends, but certainly, can still be acquaintances, still look each other up, still back each other up in our workspace, since that was a place that we had met and did some things together. I legitimately, you guys, burst into tears. And this absolutely positively never happens. In fact, I would tell you that one of my most hard and true trauma responses is that I just kind of have an indifference. It's like I can't cry, like I can't access emotions. I freeze or fawn pretty easily, but I don't demonstrate like how I'm feeling on the inside. And that was like a self-protective factor when I was in my young years growing up in an alcoholic family. Like it was just not safe, honestly, to show emotion in a family system where like your parents needed you to be under control, take care of you. And if you're not, then you're somehow impeding on them. And so like I learned really quick, like how to button it up. So crying for me, it doesn't happen very often, and it's usually something very significant. And I remember in this moment, like yesterday, like sitting there and thinking to myself, why am I crying? Like, I know I'm upset about this, but what has happened that it broke through the threshold of my usual defense mechanism here? So I was curious about that, and I wanted to stay curious about that. And B, like, if it broke through that, why this relationship? Because to be truthful with all of you, I would not have expected that from this particular friendship. There are some relationships in my life where, falling to pieces would have totally made sense in a moment like that. But a honestly, brand new friendship that had kind of like started during COVID, that was, it was situational because we met each other through situation, and then it became kind of also about our occupations, that kind of thing. Like, never would I ever have thought that that was going to be the time that I was going to melt, but I melted down. And this is one of the quintessential times where in midlife, in perimenopause, I realized there's like these breakthroughs where my emotional capacity is not what it used to be. My stress resilience is not what it used to be. And so I couldn't show up in that moment with my usual like stoic face, like totally get it, understand, have a lot of big feelings on the inside, but I'm not going to share that with you right now during the conversation. And then I would go and take care of myself later. Instead, I just melted in front of this person, which I'm sure made an even bigger deal. And, that's their stuff to have to manage. I don't it's not on my side of the fence what they did with that, but it certainly surprised the heck out of me. And it's what got me to go back into therapy more frequently. So I've been in and out of therapy my entire career as a therapist, as a psychologist. I think it's important. I teach my students this too. Like, you really should be in therapy, sit across the couch from somebody. If you're going to be sitting across the couch from somebody, it's a major part of doing this correctly, in my opinion. But sometimes I'll go for months and not do anything because I don't have anything to actively work on. But this was like, hung up that call, picked the very next call that I picked up was setting up some appointments with two therapists, an old therapist I had seen before, but also looked for a specialist because I had some thoughts. I had some thoughts about what this might be. And I was right, because when I dug into the science, this is what I have found. And I want you to keep listening today, because if you've had this experience where these things keep happening, the breakthroughs, the falling off the cliffs, it might be that you get completely emotional like I did. It could be irritability, could be fighting, could be that you just don't care about stuff that you really used to care about. And like you'd want to make yourself care about it, but you can't. Like any of these major departures from how you usually are, I have a thought about why that might be happening to you in midlife, and I want you to keep listening today so you can learn a little bit more about it. Welcome. You're listening to The Centered Midlife, a podcast that teaches women in midlife to unapologetically stop silencing their dreams and start designing the lives they want to live in. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie, and as a clinical psychologist of the last 2 decades and a twice divorced single mother myself, I not only know how hard it can feel heading into midlife, I am living it right here with you. I have taken all the many failed attempts and lessons learned in my own life and combine it with my extensive clinical experience to give you the tools you need to make midlife the best time in your life. No joke. So let's get started. Welcome back to A Centered Midlife. So today I am, opening myself up and sharing a little bit about this experience that I had where I really lost it, you guys. And I don't lose it. It was like embarrassing. Although I show up to myself with self-compassion. It's one of the tenets of the group coaching that I've done. And I have an online course about self-compassion. You've heard me talk on the podcast about self-compassion. When I see myself doing that, instead of being mad at myself, which is what I used to do, I show up with curiosity, right? I feel like curiosity can be one of the best ways to show ourselves the action of self-compassion, because instead of blaming yourself and insinuating something's wrong, curiosity really just opens up the possibility that there could be a reason for why this is happening. And you don't have to be mad at yourself about that. You might not be ready to embrace yourself. Like I was a puddle and I did not want to be a puddle in front of this person while they were basically dumping me. That was not cool. That did not feel good. And it was just a friendship. It was not a romantic relationship in any way. But I didn't realize the significance in places that it had touched. And because it didn't make sense to me, that's why I chose to stay curious. I was like, at any other time in my life, the way I would have showed up in that moment is to be very stoic and probably agreeable with the person and just say, yep, I totally understand what you're saying here. Totally makes sense to me. It's really sad. But I wouldn't really be showing much more than trying to be empathetic to their part of the side of this. Instead, I just became a blubbering child. I was just crying, and the conversation probably lasted longer than it needed to. I never rechecked in with the person. Obviously, they were dumping me, so there was no reason to recheck in with this person. But I never rechecked in to see what the experience was for them on their side. But I'm guessing that they were the conversation went longer because they were trying to help me get regulated, I guess, so that they can end the call. I'm sure they didn't want to end it with me bawling, but essentially I was bawling, and this literally never happens. I've had divorces, folks, where I stayed way stoic through really bad conversations. And I've been able to do that for like all of my life since I was a child. And this is why I was like, something's up. Like, there is a saying in therapy that if it's hysterical, it's historical. And all that is to say is like, if it's outside what you expect your emotional response to be in a moment, then it probably is tied to something historically. And that's where my curiosity went. I'm a trauma therapist by trade, by, in my clinical psychology private practice, that is the area that I've really focused in on: grief, supervision, and trauma, interpersonal trauma. Those are the three areas that I've really focused my competencies in. And to be sitting there bawling and not be able to pull it back, I couldn't pull it back. I'm just like crying, losing my mind. This person is just like, we just can't stay friends. Like, if you want to be on Facebook and say, shout out to you, like, I'm cool with that. But there are these reasons because of other people in our life that it's probably not a good idea for us to stay friends. This is just not going to work. And I didn't even disagree with what was being said. I just was like shocked and didn't see it coming. And I was like, there is something here. Like, the fact that I didn't see it coming, the fact that I am this shocked and didn't realize it when it's all laid out, it makes sense to me. And the fact that I can't emotionally reel myself in on during the conversation with this person, I knew that this had to be related to my childhood trauma. And so I wanted to unpack that immediately. Like, hung up the phone with that person, picked up the phone, made a call to my old therapist, made an appointment. And then I spent about 30 minutes looking online for a very specialized trauma therapist, because my regular therapist, that isn't their gig. But I wanted to see if, this other technique would be useful. So this is inside baseball, but essentially when you know. And so I wanted to see because I had never tried this other kind of therapy, whether it would work or not. So I ended up making appointments with that person, saw them for about 5 sessions. It didn't really do anything more than what was happening in my regular therapy. So I just kept with my regular therapy. So after this experience, I knew this had to do with midlife. I knew it. This was like 22, I want to say 2022 when this happened. And I'm going to guess that I was in perimenopause probably from like 2018, 2019 on. And 2018 is when I had my second separation and divorce. My divorce stuff, everything was finalized, I believe, in 2019, but it started in 2018. And I just knew, I had this hunch, like, this is hysterical, so it's got to be historical. The fact that I couldn't get my shit together, it must have meant that it had touched on something. My curiosities led me to make some inferences. And I was like, I kind of wonder if somehow this relationship kind of got behind my guarded place. So I probably keep most relationships in a space of this nature, in a space that's guarded, where you wouldn't be able to hurt me that much, because like losing it wouldn't matter to me. It's kind of in that acquaintanceship space. But for some reason, there was something about this person and the way they interacted with me that must have reminded me of ways that other people in my earlier life, my childhood life, had interacted with me. And so they kind of got behind my guard without my knowing, essentially. And I wasn't wrong. I mean, I've unpacked that since then. And there certainly are some similarities in what I was trying to do. And I want to talk about that today, because I think that it's fascinating that our childhood trauma can come up without our awareness in our midlife. And this was our last podcast was about this. So this is a variation on a theme, but I wanted to give you guys an example, because I think that for some of us, that's what's needed. So I, in digging through it, was able to understand that this person needed my help in lots and lots of ways. And I was getting fed from feeling like I hustled for my worth, right? I hustled for my worthiness. And I was like, if I prove to this person that I can do these things for them and I can be a useful friend to them, then I have proved my worth. And I realized that I was in this interaction like I had been within the context of my alcoholic family, because I did that kind of behavior with both my parents. With my dad, it was because like you had to earn, honestly, his attention. Like your worth was, he wouldn't even pay attention to you. you wouldn't be on his radar unless you were effing up royally or you were succeeding royally. Like anything in the middle where you were just being a good enough kid, which is where most of us should be, didn't get any of his attention, any of it. So in order to get in front of him, I was either in a fight with him about something, or I was overachieving, honestly, in order to hit his radar. And there was always that kind of cycle of, if I am valuable to this person, if I can make myself invaluable to them, then I know that I'm really loved. That's what I believed. And when I say that out loud today, that's ridiculous. Like, you should not, in a relationship, ever be in a position where you're earning that love. It should be given, right? We're committing to one another, and we're committing to love the other person or be in a relationship with the other person, whether or not they're doing for us or not doing for us. I'm guessing that part of the attraction is most of the time they're doing something that we are attracted to, right? So for the most part, that all comes out in the wash. But in my childhood, the trauma was that I was neglected unless I was overachieving. And that was where I really got most of my dad's attention, was in those accolades. And if I slipped, then I was in a fight with him because he was proving to me that he was smarter than me. The tricky thing with my dad always also was that I couldn't be better than him. And that was one of the unique qualities that I had with this individual. So we were both working together, like kind of co-creating some businesses outside of what we had usually been doing. And there was kind of this competition with that as well. And so I had to kind of like be useful to the person. But at the same time, there was this, and this is all happening internally. This person didn't know any of this. I mean, maybe they did, but I don't know if they did at all. But this is all happening. Like, this is my trauma that was like replaying in my midlife with this person, kind of under my radar, like totally unbeknownst to me. But I started to like also not want to one up them. So I didn't want to be better than what they were doing and their success, but at the same time, wanted to be succeeding. And then I also wanted to be useful to them. And so that was kind of like, if ever I felt like I was taking an edge over where they were, then I would double up on helping them out so that that would lift them up. Right. And this is the exact behavior that I used to have with my father, because his own insecurity was that he wanted all of his children to overachieve, but none of them could ever be better than him. It's a really, really hard dance that you do with an alcoholic parent. And not all alcoholic families is that the dance, but that was definitely the dance. And it, had different effects on all 5 of his children. For me, it's that I became a perpetual overachiever. And I'm always like, when I'm not in awareness of it, I'm always like falling into the old pattern of hustling for my worth and earning my keep within every relationship I have. Now, the trauma of that is that then interpersonally, relationships equal work for me. They're not bucket filling, they're bucket emptying. And even with good boundaries, like, all relationships feel that way to me. I've had to rewrite that narrative arduously over my lifetime, because if I didn't, shit, I mean, like, I would just want to retreat, be in my house and not be around people. And there have been times where I get into this, like, even now, like, the thing about trauma is it never goes away. We learn to build better behaviors around it. So we're not in our trauma responses, we're in our living, breathing, thriving types of behaviors in our life. We stop becoming the old pattern of, here's my trauma response, I've got to earn my worth. And we realize, I have a tendency towards that. So I got to be careful and pay attention, and also let myself be fallible in my relationships, and also let myself say no when I usually would have said yes, because I need them to love me for who I am, not what I give them. Right. And so that's the kind of boundary that I've had to set in. But my old pattern prior to lots and lots of therapy was that I would always be hustling. And that had slipped in with this relationship. It was very interesting to me that it had happened, that it went through kind of my blinders and I didn't see it coming. That might have been because it was a friendship and not like, a significant relationship. I think for the most part, I play out those roles in like significant romantic relationships, my marriages, my, partners, that kind of thing. But I've also seen it play out at work. I've also, like this, I'm not immune to falling into my old patterns in other places as well. So I unpacked that and I realized, oh shit, so this is what I did. And I also had some of that dance with my mom. I won't bore us to death with going into all of that, but there was also a piece with my mom where she was a very emotive person. This person that I had a friendship with was very emotive, and the emotive person has to be the more important one. Like their feeling needs are more important than my feeling needs are. And so there were some of those patterns that were playing out there as well. And I exploded into tears when it all went down, because not rational, right? So it's hysterical, not because it's historical. It's not just based on the relationship I really had with this friend, but because it like felt like, smelled like, walked like a duck, like I thought it was the relationship I had had with my parents. So when it went away, I re-grieved because I've lost both my parents. Back in 2022, this happened and I burst into tears because basically I was re-experiencing the grief of the loss of those significant relationships. It had way more to do with what I lost from my parents than it had to do with losing this friendship. And had I been able to keep those two separate, which normally I am, I would have just done that stoic thing and agreed with this person and said, great time that we had together. This was a friendship for a season. Thank you. And best to you, right? Which is how I would have really loved to have had that conversation. But instead, because midlife and perimenopause breaks through your stress resiliency, I couldn't do that. And I had let this trauma bonding kind of replay itself out in my adult life. So I went back to therapy, figured all that out. But then Dr. Natalie went back to the science. And I have some scientific basis for why is it that women in midlife like have the susceptibility to experience their childhood trauma. Why, even if they feel like they've resolved it, why is it re-presenting itself? Now, the science can't tell you exactly what's causing this, but there is some highly correlative data. So in scientist terms, correlation means this goes up when this goes up, this goes down when this goes down, right? Or if this goes down, this goes up. If this goes down, this goes up. So there's a correlation. Either they're going up and down together or they're always in opposition to one another, but it's statistically significant. Like this is not chance that those two things are happening. It's happening because there's a strong connection between the two, not necessarily one causing the other, but strong connection at some level, right? Now you can infer sometimes there's causation, and I'll talk about that here, but I have some statistics. So there's a study called the SWAN study, and it started in the 90s. And I'm trying to remember, of course, what SWAN means, but I'll find it. Study of women's health across the nation. So the SWAN study, launched in the University of Pittsburgh in the 90s, looked at nearly like 3,300 women. And at the time they started it, it's a longitudinal study, which means they follow these women across time. In the 90s, they were between the ages of 42 and 52. So now, or they've had like 17 years that they followed these people. They're in their 70s, late 70s, right? So like there is over 30 years of data from 3,300 women. Think about that. That's pretty profound because in science, we don't study the women's very much. We should be studying them much more. But this SWAN study had some really specific things. So I'm going to just go through. I have my phone out so that I can remember these statistics because I'm also in midlife and, the things kind of go away. But essentially, there is a direct link, so correlation again, between childhood trauma and worsened midlife outcomes. Hard stop. So think about this. Like about half of the women, they have a way of measuring this, had childhood trauma. So of the 3,300, that's what? I got to do math in my head. So it's like 1,750, I think. About, almost 2,000 of these women had some childhood trauma. And what they saw is that they had way more hot flashes and night sweats and insomnia and mood lability, which means mood swings up and down, up and down. They had all of those, perimenopausal symptoms we've been talking about on the podcast at much higher rates. So, and it's not chance that this happens. It's the women who had childhood trauma that then experienced this later. They saw that their psychology and hormones were deeply intertwined. They aren't separate systems, but more like intricately intertwined. So if one is disrupted, then others are. So emotionally, when you're abused as a child, that's disrupted. And then that is intricately intertwined with your hormonal system, which makes sense because you've heard me talk about this on the podcast. Hormones like serotonin and norepinephrine and GABA and dopamine, like these are things, they're called neurotransmitters, but they're hormones essentially, right? Like they are the things that then drive our feeling states. So it makes a ton of sense that this is all gonna kind of be in combination. So midlife then becomes this critical intervention window for people like me in the business, like, and your medical doctors, becomes a critical window that if we don't screen, do you have trauma? We're not going to treat you well enough, because we should come at some of these things more intensely if you've had the trauma than if you haven't. Because what we know from the science is these kinds of things are going to go up. So let me read some of the stuff off. So women with 4 or more, what they call ACEs, and ACE is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And there's 10 questions, and they amount to, 4 different kinds of abuse, neglect, whether your family was divorced, whether your parent was incarcerated, if you felt like you had, there was belonging in your family, like they had your back. These are the kinds of questions. They're they're just pretty simple. And then it's like, were you sexually abused, physically abused, verbally abused, that kind of stuff. So you go through that and you get a score of 1 to 10. If you have 4 or more, here's the physical symptoms of your menopause will be 10 times higher. The burden of them, 10 times higher than if you don't have 4 or more on that score. What? If you have 2 or more on that score, that more than doubles your risk of a first episode of major depression in menopause. So I go back to this whole event that happened with my friend. I had a resurgence of old patterns of my trauma, in large part because I have a score of somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 or 6. Depends on how you look at some of the the questions, but we'll go with 5. I have a 5, which means that I have a higher rate of all of these symptoms during menopause. And I've had depression in my past, and I was having a resurgence, and I was caught off guard because it was 2022 and we had just come out of COVID and there was all these other things. And so it was legitimately like, this relationship was filling a need, a space, unbeknownst to me, that felt parental or felt like I felt with my parents, right? Because remember, my parents didn't parent me, I parented them more, unfortunately. But this relationship had these elements in it that I was playing out. Not because that person asked me to, just because my own stuff was vulnerably showing up and bleeding through at this age. Here's some other things. Childhood trauma is linked to 87% higher odds of persistent insomnia. So you're in perimenopause, you're having trouble sleeping. It's not just perimenopause. If you have childhood trauma, 87% likelihood is that your sleep pattern problem is related to that and is exacerbated by the perimenopause, but not caused by the perimenopause. So again, it's like, perimenopause doesn't create this. Menopause doesn't create this. Midlife doesn't, create depression and anxiety and anger issues and trauma issues coming back up. It allows them to break through. I'll say that again. It allows those symptoms, those mental health issues to break through. You have held it up. You have crutched it up as best you can. And now you can't do that anymore. Why? You can't do that anymore because in perimenopause, you don't have access to the amount of dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA that you would need to insulate yourself. And so you're going to have to figure out a different way to deal with that. I had to go back and I had to unpack it, and I had to say, man, I had unpacked this once, but that was based on capacity that I had before that I no longer have, right? One more statistic I want to share with you. Women with 2 or more ACEs, so again, those 10 questions, face a triple threat. Oh, here we go. So you get reduced estradiol more than you would just in your perimenopause and menopause, increased inflammation, which is, tied to a ton of health risk issues, autoimmune disorders, metabolic disorders, aches and pains, inflammation, right? And you are likely to have early life stress sequelae converging. So what this means is you're going to have patterns that you learned that were not really the best to deal with stress early on in your life because that was the way you survive. So this is, in layman's terms, what we call this is your survival mode strategies that worked well enough with high levels of estrogen, which allowed for high levels of dopamine and serotonin and GABA and all of the things that I've mentioned. Now, no. Those strategies really weren't great. They were more propped up by the hormones. And so you don't have the hormones, these strategies won't work. So we're going to have to move you over here and start new strategies. And I just want like 2 or more of those questions. That's it. You could have had parents divorced and felt like your family never had your back. You've got a 2 on the ACEs, right? I think this is so significant, and I hope I didn't bore you too much with the science today. I did get a little nerdy on you, but I want us to just put in perspective. These things are not happening to us for no reason, and we don't need to be mad at ourselves and double down on old patterns that early stress resilience sequelae, as they call it in the science. We don't have to do those old patterns of survival mode because we know it was never the patterns. That we were actually saved by we were drugged up on all of those female hormones, which drove up our estrogen. Our estrogen drove up things like dopamine, drove up things like serotonin, drove up things like GABA, and allowed us to be able to handle way more than we ever should have been, right? We had superhuman stress resilience. So it didn't matter that we had a bad stress survival mode habit. Now it does, and it does big time. And so if you're noticing these changes in your life, like these places where you just like fall off a cliff, like I thought everything was going well, and then I want you to stay curious. That's what I want to leave you with today. Don't be mad at yourself. Please don't double down on what you've always done, because I can reasonably assume that it probably isn't working. And hey, if you're curious, the CDC website has the Adverse Childhood Experience Study Questionnaire, the 10 questions. Go take it. It's pretty simple, 1 to 10, right? Figure out what your score is, because 2 or more has statistics that are tied to it, right? 4 or more has major health condition issues, and that menopause and perimenopause is going to be harder on you. So you need to advocate triple time when we go to our doctors. Like, it has to be, we have to do something with this, HRT or whatever. For me, it has actually been psychotropic medication. So antidepressant, anti-anxiety medication, and an attentional medication for my brain fog, right? I had to do all of those in order for me to feel like I wasn't in survival mode all the time, because that's what menopause and perimenopause was doing to me. And it's in large part because I have a 5 on the ACE. It is not an accident that this happens to me, and it's not probably an accident if it's happening to you. So I want you to get more educated about what's happening and what's going on in your body, and educate your health providers. Take care of yourselves out there, okay, ladies? Because you too can have a centered midlife. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I have to make sure at the end of each of these episodes that I give you the disclaimer that none of the material that I talk about in these podcasts is meant to replace any kind of therapy or formal medical or mental health treatment. And in fact, anything that I offer on my website, my coaching programs, any kind of psychoeducational materials that I release are not a replacement for that level of care. So just take that into account when you listen. This is information for you, and hopefully you find it of value, both as an educational tool and for your entertainment. And I also want to mention that if anyone you know is in a mental health crisis, needs additional help, I always include these two crisis resources. They're available to anybody. Pick up the phone and dial 988 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And you can always visit their website at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Additionally, there's actually a crisis text line. So if you're not somebody that likes to pick up the phone, text HOME, home, to 741-741 to the crisis text line. You can find them online at crisistextline.org. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and I hope that you like and follow me wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe consider leaving me a review. It always helps me to keep this podcast relevant when I know what you want to hear about.